For coming along. This is our second coffee morning. What I omitted to say the last day was I probably should have welcomed all the new members that have joined over the last while, because we've quite a lot of new members that joined over the last few months. Obviously, we're keen for more. So if you colleagues or people looking in are interested, just send in your applications to the centre. The other is welcome to people from who have decanted from the older building that's now going to be refurbished and who are now resident in this part of the temporarily resident over here in this wing of the science building. So all welcome to come to the more the merrier. So if something is interesting, please come along. If you fancy just a social attribute of it, you're very welcome to do that as well. So now I'm just going to hand over in a minute to Jess Beck. So Jess is a new institute member as well. She's an Ad Astra fellow, joined UCD just in the last year. So she's joined us from Harvard. So we're delighted to get someone really high caliber researcher joining UCD and becoming a member of the Earth Institute as well. So she's going to talk about osteoarchaeology, learning about ancient lives by analysing human skeleton. Topic area, and I suppose that's one of the great things about the Earth Institute. No matter what your interest, there's going to be someone who has something to talk about that's going to meet your interests over the course of a trimester. So really good opportunities to see some really interesting topics. So I'll just hand over now to Jess, and thanks very much for helping us out today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I'll give you this.
Also add is sorry I have to park on a college planning day, away day over the Ardmore House. So unfortunately, my apologies, I have to park.
Am I all set with the mic?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you for inviting me. Let's see if this works. I might have to switch this back to. This is how you can tell that I'm an excellent faculty member. Immediate technical difficulties. No. Okay. Are we all set? Yes. All right. So today I've pitched this talk to people from outside of the School of Archaeology, though many of my colleagues from the School of Archaeology are unexpectedly here, in order to think about potential connections and collaborations with people who share my interest in inequality and human social change. So I've structured this talk into 3 parts. I'm going to open by saying a little bit about who I am, and then I'll move on to what I do, namely asking what human skeletons can teach us about ancient lives. Then finally, I'll introduce some of my ongoing research and how it examines inequality at multiple scales. And my talk today is going to focus on research questions and active projects rather than results, though I'm happy to talk about results during the sort of coffee period afterwards, because I'm really interested in thinking about potential connections and collaborations with people working on similar topics or questions. So to start with who I am an osteoarchaeologist, and that means I study human skeletal remains from archaeological sites. So sometimes you'll find me in the field excavating, leveling total stations. Other times you'll find me in a museum basement, generally kind of cold, without windows, sometimes mildewy, analyzing very fragmentary human bones to try to figure out how many people are represented in a particular assemblage. I'm also occasionally in the lab conducting biochemical analyses that can tell us about human diet and mobility in the past. And in terms of where I'm coming from professionally, Harvard was the last stop in a series of different moves. I started by getting my PhD at the University of Michigan in 2016. After that, I had a 1-year postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh, a 2-year Marie Curie Fellowship at the McDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at the University of Cambridge. I adjuncted at Vassar College, and then I was a college teaching fellow for a year at Harvard. So I've been all over the map, and that kind of feeds into my research in a way I'll talk about in a little bit. So I've explained a little bit about my background, who I am, but why do I focus on human skeletons if I'm interested in issues of inequality in the human past? The reason I focus on skeletons is because they're kind of a nexus of both identity and lived experience. Bodies can tell us a lot about who someone was. As an osteoarchaeologist, for example, I can use skeletal indicators in order to estimate age. So if you've ever cradled a baby and felt the top of their head, that soft spot, That's an area where bones are still growing together or fusing. And that's how all of the bones in your body, or most of the bones in your body, form. We can look at patterning, anatomical patterning, in when those developmental markers are occurring to estimate the age someone was when they died. Another aspect of the skeleton we can look at is teeth, patterns of dental eruption or dental wear. So most of us will remember the kind of creepy feeling of your permanent teeth coming in underneath your baby teeth. If you have kids yourself, you'll have witnessed this process from kind of a very close perspective. And that patterning of eruption and development is something that we can also use to estimate age. Similarly, we can access gender, not immediately through the skeleton, but through a combination of looking at skeletal indicators of biological sex, basically morphological or shape-based traits of the skull and pelvic girdle, and combine that with archaeological context, so the society someone lived in and how identity was expressed, to think about gender in the past. Isotopes, so different varieties of the same element with different weights that you can measure using particular types of technology, can tell us about where someone was from. And we can compare isotopes in someone's teeth, which form when you're a kid, and so represent kind of a time capsule of your childhood, and isotopes in bone, which remodels every 5 to 10 years or so, to think about if someone moved over the course of their lifetime and whether there are chemical traces of that in their bones. And then finally, ancient DNA is a big topic in archaeology right now, and we can combine that with archaeological understandings of social organization to think about kinship in the past. So already there are a number of different aspects of identity that are encoded in human skeletons, but there are also important aspects of lived experience, especially lived experiences that correspond to experiences of inequality that we know about today. So domains like diet, disease, stress, differential labor burdens, trauma, or different environments that people live in or are forced to live in. And I won't talk about all of these today, but if we think about something like severe physiological stress, the kind of stress that comes from near starvation experiences of malnourishment, for example, that actually shows up in your teeth. Remember, your teeth form when you're a child, and during that process of enamel formation, if your body's energy is disrupted, so disrupted by a really severe episode of disease or starvation, then you actually see a line of interrupted growth on enamel that's macroscopically visible. We can look at that without even needing to use a microscope. And so looking at that over space and time can tell us about how people experience different childhood stressors and who is subjected to that kind of stress. Similarly, by comparing age relative to stature, so the height of someone using the length of long bones, we can look at growth stunting and see if and when that was occurring in the past. So in addition to all those markers of identity, skeletons can give us a sense of the experiences someone undertook during their life. So finally, how do I bring this together to investigate inequality? I think about my work as investigating inequality at 3 different scales. At the local level, I'm focused on southwestern Transylvania and a pretty limited area surrounding the Apusan Mountains. The regional level, my work covers all of the Iberian Peninsula, so a little broader scale. And then finally, at the disciplinary level, partially as a result of me having experienced a number of different institutions in my early career, I'm focused on knowledge production. Who gets to make claims about the past, what claims are valorized, and who gets to kind of survive and thrive in academia when it comes to archaeology. And that last one strays a little bit far afield from the topic of osteoarchaeology, but I realized when I was putting this together that if anyone in the Earth Institute is doing knowledge production work, I'd like to connect with them. So in terms of that local scale, I'm really focused on the relationship between human social organization, embodied inequalities, and resource control. And the area that and time period I focus on is Bronze Age Transylvania. The Bronze Age occurred in Romania during the 3rd millennium BC, so from about 2700 to 2000 BC. And my colleagues and I work in southwestern Transylvania in the areas shown on the rectangle on screen. And the reason we work there in this region that kind of sits at the intersection of the Transylvanian Plateau and the Apusan Mountains is because it's a really resource-rich area. The metal mountains in that region have some of the richest deposits of copper and gold in all of Europe. You've also got the Murish River, which moves from Eastern Europe into Central Europe, and so links different regions of Europe together because it dumps into the Danube. So that was something of a prehistoric thoroughfare, almost a highway by which people and goods and maybe ideas could move throughout prehistory. And finally, the lowlands also contain massive salt deposits. My colleague Colin Quinn refers to this area of Transylvania as a Bronze Age Costco. It's an area where you could get any of the resources you needed in one kind of nice small package. And there's also a natural comparison built into the communities and kind of cemeteries that were located in this region. The uplands are areas that are close to those really rich metal resources. The lowlands are close to the river. That sort of means of connecting people and things and situating exchange networks in the past. So there's a built-in comparison between different types of resources, either metal-based or kind of exchange-based. And so here, the two sort of driving questions we're asking are first, how cemeteries are located relative to these resources. What are people prioritizing when they bury their dead? Are all the dead up in the metal mountains close to metal resources, or are more of them located along the river? And second, do we see restriction in mortuary treatment relative to things like age or sex at upland versus lowland cemeteries? Do you have everyone buried in lowland cemeteries, a complete cross-section of society, and then only, say, adult women buried in the uplands? We don't know any of that until we look at the osteoarchaeology. And here we have a collaborative international project that brings together the skill sets of archaeologists and osteoarchaeologists. I collaborate with Dr. Colin Quinn, who's at the University at Buffalo, and Dr. Hoya Shigudyan, who's at the National Museum of the Union in Alba Iulia. And we each contribute different analytical skill sets to this project, which involves surveying, excavation at upland mortuary sites, osteoarchaeological analysis of both recently excavated and kind of legacy collections that have never been analyzed, and then isotopic analysis of past diet and mobility. So expanding things out to the regional scale, we're going to move south into the Iberian Peninsula, into the Copper Age. And the Copper Age in Iberia occurred at about the same time as the early Bronze Age in Romania. We're talking about the 3rd millennium BC. So this is a period of widespread transformation in Europe. And you can also conceive of my research as investigating what's going on in different parts of the continent. During the Copper Age, we see some of the same patterns as the early Bronze Age. People are pretty dependent on domesticates. They're using them both for meat and for secondary products, things like wool or traction. And we're seeing a massive expansion of exchange networks. One thing that always throws me is that at some of the larger sites and some of the mortuary sites of the Copper Age, you have ostrich eggshells from North Africa, and you have elephant ivory. And you would assume that all of that elephant ivory is also coming from those same exchange networks that are bringing in the ostrich eggshells, because they already exist. But sourcing studies have shown that that ivory comes from both African and Asian elephants. So that gives you a sense of how vast the resources were that were concentrated in this peninsula at this point in time. And there's also some changes to material culture and to mortuary practices. But the transformation that's most compelling for me to think about as an anthropologist is the fact that we see new types of sites on the landscape. This is a period that witnesses the emergence of what are called mega sites. Places like Valencina de la Concepción, which is outside of Seville, are 400 hectares in size. Marroquías, which is right outside Jaén, is 113 hectares in size. And these sorts of sizes of sites don't persist into the early Bronze Age. We don't see them again until Roman times, which gives you a sense of how there's a kind of fluorescence of unusual activity at this point in time. So here my main question is whether we see new forms of inequality emerging at these kinds of complex, larger scale sites, which are bringing with them new problems in terms of how to navigate relationships with neighbors, how to demarcate territory, how to manage resources, how to organize communal labor. So what does that look like on the ground? And are people using similar strategies at all megasites, or are things really variable across the peninsula? Here, I combine osteoarchaeology, some of those biochemical analyses of diet and mobility that I mentioned previously, and also a comparative approach. I started out conducting an osteoarchaeological analysis of one of the populations at one of the really large megasites, and now I'm moving into a much smaller scale one to think about mortuary practices and social organization at very different scales within the peninsula. All right, finally, the last kind of vein of my research right now is informed by the experience of being at 6 institutions over 6 years. This has led me to question a lot of the kind of received wisdom about how the academy works. And so here I ask things like how prestige and value are generated and understood within the academy. What sorts of assumptions and unconscious biases pervade processes like peer review, the job market, and the publication process? And also thinking about how we can make these systems of knowledge production more equitable, both for us as academics and for the general public who's interested in our research. Here, I do not have a clearly delineated research program. I'm just involved in a lot of different projects in a kind of magpie-like fashion. And some of these are shown on screen, and I will happily talk anyone's ear off about them afterwards. But some examples are a workshop I'm running in mid-October through the Winter Gren Foundation with collaborator Laura Stout, who's at Stanford, where we're bringing together archaeologists who are working on different aspects of research on knowledge production and anthropologists from other subfields to think about interventions we can make to make the field more equitable. Similarly, I'm involved in a 23 author collaborative group called Changing the Landscape of Archaeological Publishing. And for those of you who have submitted publications, thinking about the process of submitting a final draft or agreeing on a revisions process with that many authors it's kind of a daunting prospect, but I think the collaborative aspect is important. Finally, another project involves drawing on methods from social psychology to look at the implicit associations archaeologists may hold between fieldwork and gender or lab work using what are called implicit association tests. So really trying to be interdisciplinary in this approach. So in sum, I'm really interested in collaborating and talking to people, or collaborating with and talking to people who are working on problems of resource control and management, aggregation and conflict related to human aggregation and how that's managed, issues of deep history, social flexibility, and interdisciplinary approaches to informing the public about the deep past. Methodologically, if anyone works with isotopes, I would love to chat about resources. And then finally, anyone working on knowledge production, I'd also be very happy to talk to. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the institutions and sources of funding that have supported this research. And I'm happy to take questions.